Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for tuning in today. As the atrocities of the Holocaust fade from living memory, archives become even more crucial. More than 75 years after the Nuremberg Trials began, the International Court of Justice in The Hague has authorized Stanford University to manage the long-term digital preservation of archival and research materials from those trials. Dr. David Cohen, director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University, a partner in the project, and a leading expert on the post-war World War II trials, is here to speak with me about the pioneering initiative that will centralize and improve accessibility and preservation of International Military Tribunal records. Dr. Cohen is a leading expert in the fields of human rights, international law, and transitional justice. He taught at UC Berkeley from 1979 to 2012 and served as the founding director of the Berkeley War Crimes Studies Center, which moved to Stanford in 2013 and became the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Dr. Cohen holds the WSD Honda Professorship in Human Rights and International Justice and is appointed in the Classics Department at Stanford. Dr. Cohen, we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you very much.
Well, before we delve into the historic gathering of documentation on a more granular level, give us an overview of Stanford University's efforts to digitize the Nuremberg trial archives. Why was Stanford chosen by the International Court of Justice in The Hague to undertake this task?
Well, I guess where I should begin is the partnership between our center and the Stanford University Library, which has been one of the most exciting features of moving our center from Berkeley to Stanford. The Stanford Library, as I'm sure many know, is one of the world's leaders in the development of advanced digital technologies for creating multimedia platforms to make materials of different kinds meaningfully accessible. And in conversations with the director of the Stanford Library, Mike Keller, as he learned about the work that we were doing in terms of collecting archival materials on World War II war crimes trials, we formed a partnership. And the current acquisition of the digital archives of the Nuremberg Tribunal are a major step towards realizing what our vision is of creating a comprehensive global resource of the World War II war crimes trials and their legacy today. So that's the broader context in which this acquisition has taken place. Why was Stanford selected? Because over a 2-year period, we, led by Mike Keller, were in discussions with the Peace Palace, as we have been with some other international organizations, about the possibility of acquiring this material. And I think ultimately the Peace Palace decided to partner with us of the kind of unique constellation of resources that Stanford provides in terms both of the capacity of the library to permanently preserve a collection like this, to make it accessible, and then in partnership with our center to provide a focal point for research and education using these materials.
And I suppose the answer to the why now, I guess I'm asking a rhetorical question, is that we now have the technology to do this. Before all of this was committed, I'm sure, to volumes and volumes of court records, but now we're able to do something different with this. So tell us about that technological ability that makes all this possible.
Yeah, so first of all, I have to admit that I am not a tech person, but I sort of learn as I go, tagging along with the library's team. But previously we were in the U.S. National Archives, we stood with a huge collection in this area. we were dealing with paper, not even bound volumes, but case files, millions of pages, cataloged only in the broadest categories. So not searchable, essentially. And I can tell you, having spent quite a lot of time in various dusty archives that have World War II collections around the world, the amount of time that it takes to go through collections that are hundreds of thousands or millions of pages is something that a researcher can't do in his or her lifetime, actually. And so the wealth of material that is available has been available for those who want to go sit in an archive for months or years, but has not been accessible more broadly. And when I talk about accessibility, I think more directly answer your question, one of the first components is making a massive collection searchable so that we can utilize all of the material that's in it by quickly accessing what's most relevant for a particular research focus. In the case of the Nuremberg material, we're not only dealing with, well over 1 million pages of documents, but we're also dealing with an audio recording of a trial over many months, of a photographic archive, of a substantial amount of moving images that were done for newsreel coverage and so forth. An archive of all the sort of press clippings and press releases and press materials. So the question is, how do you organize that in a way that can be used in education and research and for the public with an interest in the Holocaust that doesn't require a kind of expertise in research and in this area that very few people have. And that's where the platforms, digital platforms that the Stanford Library has developed, they have names like Spotlight, like Mirador, et cetera, enable us to put together multimedia collections that highlight themes or issues of particular interest and enable a broader public or students to find their way quickly to the kind of information that they are seeking. So the idea is to address the needs of different user groups with different interests, rather than simply researchers who have spent a good part of their life dealing with materials like this. And I think that's the challenge. And that's what the Stanford Library has a capacity of doing. And of course, in our partnership, then we have some understanding of the historical importance of the contents, the substantive contents of a collection like this. And so we work closely together to design the platforms that will make these resources available.
Something that may seem obvious to us in the Jewish community, to historians and scholars, but cannot be overlooked, is the significance of the material itself. And so in the context of history and remembrance, which becomes increasingly important the further we get away from the Holocaust, what makes the archives so important today?
Well, I think there are several reasons. The one which would most often be cited by legal scholars, international lawyers, and prosecutors, judges, and so forth, is that the IMT, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, is the foundation of modern international criminal law. It's the foundation on which all of the new tribunals for Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and so forth are built, because it established the principle of individual responsibility, regardless of whether or not one is a head of state or a general or a foreign minister or a person lower in the bureaucracy, but more directly connected to mass atrocity. And it's not just that there's a principle, But what we see at Nuremberg is the way that principle was applied to a government, to a regime, to a historical period, to provide a framework for holding individuals accountable for their specific roles as individuals in perpetrating genocide and mass atrocity. So in that sense, Nuremberg is a foundation and it's a guideline, a framework for all that is followed. Second, in terms of its historical importance, there is no other genocide that has been as massively documented, as massively researched, and as best understood as what we have at Nuremberg. And that's because unparalleled resources, especially of the United States, which by far had the largest war crimes investigation operation supporting Nuremberg and the largest prosecution team, because of the energy that they devoted, not just to documenting, okay, this many people were killed in this extermination center concentration camp, this many people, were used as slave labor and so forth, but understanding how a government organized itself to make that possible. Every part of a government. I mean, if you look at the defendants at Nuremberg, they represent the German state and German society. They cover the foreign ministry, the national bank, finance, the organization of the economic resources of a country during wartime that's perpetrating a genocide, the security apparatus, the military, the political party, and in principle, also German industry, except that the American prosecution team indicted the wrong Krupp. And the Krupp enterprises were tried at the Nuremberg subsequent proceedings rather than at the IMT, which was unfortunate.
The goal of the Taube archive of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Trial, the roof under which the complete archives will be housed, is to manage the long-term digital preservation of the documents, the transcripts, the photographs, films, as you've said, the audio recordings from this historic post-war trial. But for decades, information about the tribunal has been dispersed around the world. How have you managed to reach out, and what will you be doing to gather any other material that may not be in, let's say, in the right place or in the place that's expected?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, I mean, first of all, let's be clear about what the Peace Palace collection represents. The Peace Palace, which is the seat of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, was the designated official repository for the archive of the Nuremberg Tribunal when it closed. And in our photographic collection that we have obtained as part of what we have from the Peace Palace, they documented the loading of the trucks in Nuremberg, of their unloading at the Peace Palace in The Hague, as they transferred what would eventually constitute the treasure trove of material that historians would work on for decades. However, although that is the complete collection of the tribunal itself, we have to remember that the tribunal was composed of prosecution teams and judges from 4 countries. And each of those generated their own body of documentation that was independent of the tribunal. All of the memoranda, the studies, the negotiations, and so on and so forth that were conducted by the U.S. government, the War Department, the White House, the Department of State, et cetera, and their counterparts, the British Foreign Office, et cetera, in England and, of course, in France and the Soviet Union. So for a complete understanding of the trial, it's important to collect those materials as well. In addition, the war crimes investigation done to prepare for Nuremberg. Remember, we're talking about an investigation of crimes committed over a massive geographical area and over many years. I mean, this is not like investigating an ordinary crime. This is investigating, the initial list of major German war criminals potential to be tried at Nuremberg was 50,000 names. Telford Taylor, the deputy prosecutor, US prosecutor at Nuremberg, and the chief prosecutor in the Nuremberg subsequent proceedings, narrowed that down to 5,000. That gives you an idea of the scope of what we're talking about. And they collected information on many of those individuals. They could not be tried at Nuremberg. Many of them were tried in the almost 500 US military trials conducted at Dachau. The information that came from the Nuremberg investigation was vital for those prosecutions. And those prosecutions covered the concentration camps of Dachau, Mauthausen, Nordhausen, Buchenwald, and others. So there's also the broader significance of the Nuremberg investigative materials. And they, for example, are in the US National Archives, another massive collection of more than 1 million pages on paper, never microfilm, never digitized. And so that's one of our next steps in thinking about how we take this central pillar of Nuremberg and show the context around it and what impact it had on the broader the broader initiative to achieve accountability for genocide in World War II.
What kind of staff are you assembling for this? Because clearly you need historians, you need legal scholars, you need digital preservation experts. This is not the work of one or two people. How are you assembling that staff?
So the first steps in doing that are at the library, because I'm also new to this sort of world of information technology that's involved here. But it's not that, okay, we received hard drives, hundreds of terabytes of data from the Peace Palace. It's not, oh, well, we just put those online. No, that'll be a year or 2 years from now, because they need to be ingested into a system. They need the metadata and so forth that will make them an actual resource, as opposed to a bunch of data that nobody can really use. So the library is staffing up to do this, thanks to the generosity of the Taube Philanthropies, who have provided us with resources to sort of build the human team, the team and the technical infrastructure that will enable us to make the material accessible. So the library is in the process of hiring some people who will expand the staff that works on this. Right now, we've had a team composed of myself and the associate director of my center, together with 4 people at the library, where we've been working on these issues for a long time together to develop the platform. But now, with this massive collection, that team will have to be expanded with individuals who will do this full time for probably 3 years or so. And then on our side at the center, we will be then seeking the resources to enable us to develop exactly the kind of program that you mentioned, bringing postdoctoral scholars, having conferences, providing fellowships for students who want to work on this material on master theses, senior honors theses, doctoral dissertations, a whole range of activities. Because preservation is one thing. You mentioned preservation. That's a separate matter, and that is only institutions like major libraries can guarantee that 20 years from now, when operating systems have changed, when our digital world looks different, let alone 50 years from now or whatever, that this material will still be available. And that's what the Stanford Digital Repository does. It provides permanent preservation. So then again, on our side at the center, our responsibility is to work with the library to do something with this incredible collection that we have. And that's sort of the next phase of our work.
Well, the easy accessibility of the archives portraying the brutal crimes of the Nazis, do you think will it improve Holocaust awareness and sensitivity and help to combat Holocaust denial? I asked the question because I'm thinking in terms of the motion picture judgment at Nuremberg, the recent, we're now, I think, 1960, 60 years from the Eichmann trial. Witnesses, unfortunately, the biological clock is ticking. So in the motion picture, we see witnesses who present their horrendous experiences. And of course, in the Eichmann trial, the actual victims were there to tell this story. Now, at some point, we're going to be beyond those survivors, and the number is diminishing all the time, who have tattoos on their arms to say, look, I experienced this, I went through this. So in addition to being a researcher's tool or an archive for academic studies, how do you think this will impact the issue of the story of the Holocaust and the issue of Holocaust denial, which is something that we are really dealing with now, and it's unfortunately, a growing phenomenon?
Yes, it is. It is unfortunately a growing phenomenon, and one that very much needs to be addressed, as does the rise of anti-Semitism, of mass atrocity crimes, in countries that have also said never again, and so forth. So I very much agree with you of the contemporary importance of doing whatever we can so that this material has a present day impact. So, first of all, you're right about the fact that there is what Simon Wiesenthal said at some point, this process of Nazi hunting, as he called it, and bringing people to trial ends because there are no more people to put on trial. There are 2 trials underway today, or prosecutions in Germany, of concentration camp staff. A woman who was the secretary of the commander of the Stutthof concentration camp has been indicted. There are no witnesses. And so the case will be built upon documentation. So while we don't have witnesses, we have their stories. We have their images. That's what we have in these kinds of records, both from Nuremberg and from trials related to Nuremberg, like the ones that I mentioned. We have depositions that were taken, sort of affidavits, of hundreds of individuals who told their stories, who they were, how they came to a concentration camp, what they experienced, and how they survived. It's our job to make that material accessible and meaningful. It's meaningful in itself, but it needs to be accessible in a meaningful way so that it can be accessed and integrated into educational curricula around the world. And that's our ambition in schools and universities and so forth. So that Nuremberg is not viewed as, oh, Nuremberg is ancient history. No, that Nuremberg has a present relevance today. And it's important to understand that relevance because of the violence in the world that we live in today. And I think that's our goal with this collection. I'm, in some sense, a legal historian, but I'm not interested in just archiving history. I'm interested in making it relevant and useful today.
For sure, there's no question. We still don't have even a majority of the states in our country that have adopted any kind of formal Holocaust education programming. So we have a long way to go here, not to mention, of course, elsewhere. And we see continually from the left and the right, those anti-Semites on those sides of the spectrum seeking to denigrate or minimize the Holocaust. And this is why what you're doing, I think, is extremely important. And I think what you've said about this being a living project and not just something to be done to kind of tie in a neat bow and put this all on the shelf is so important. I want to ask you, though, I mean, over the past year or so, has the pandemic changed Stanford's plans in any way in how you're dealing with digitizing these archives, if at all? And does COVID highlight the even greater need for digital preservation and remembrance?
Yes, well, fortunately, the pandemic did not have a significant impact on ultimately on this acquisition, but it did slow the process up because of the, Mike Teller, and I, have been going to the Hague, a couple of times a year for a while now. And of course, that was no longer possible. And so, when you go to talk to people, they make the time to talk with you and to do what needs to be done. Under the press of the pandemic and institutions adjusting to it, things become a bit more attenuated. But I mean, ultimately, we have the hard drives, and so in that way, that's fine. I think one thing, that I've learned certainly, and our center has, in operating, under these conditions digitally, for more than a year now, is that we can do things that we probably wouldn't have thought we could do, online and digitally. We're very actively engaged in training judges and prosecutors and human rights commissions and so forth around the world, especially in Asia. And, we were surprised at how quickly some court systems and so forth adapted. And so I think we've seen that we can be more creative than maybe we thought we could in terms of how to operate digitally and do things faster, with less expense, and with significant impact than we had previously imagined. So, in terms of the way we'll make the collection available, in terms of an electronic resource, I don't think it has that great an impact. Where I think there is a real potential is in using the collection for educational purposes, conferences, workshops, whatever, where we've now understood, okay, we don't need necessarily to bring people from all over the world at great expense to some location, where we all sit down together for a day or 2 days or whatever. And there's no question it's better to do it in person. But what we have found is that we can do those activities more often and use our budget better in some ways if we selectively operate remotely.
If I can, just to look at the trials themselves, looking back, you mentioned Dr. Telford Taylor. There were others, of course, involved in this effort. How do you view these were really giants in their field? How do you view them now, looking back? Have they received the kind of credit that was due them at the time? This is only a very short time after the end of the war. How do you, as one who's looking back but also looking forward, how do you look at these figures?
Well, I mean, one who immediately leaps to mind is Ben Ferencz, of course, in the sense that he was someone who devoted at least a very significant part of his life to bringing the Nuremberg legacy into fruition, in the sense that, I mean, not just in terms of remembering the Holocaust and the trial, but the vision of those who created Nuremberg was that it would be the forerunner of a permanent international judicial body that would be above politics, that wouldn't require to be created ad hoc, and that would build on the Nuremberg legacy to hold heads of state and others accountable for these kinds of crimes. And, beginning in July 2002, when the International Criminal Court came into being, then that vision was realized. It's still imperfectly realized because many countries, including the United States, have not joined the court. But, so the work of people like Ferencz, who were inspired by Nuremberg, was critical. And having that Nuremberg precedent was critical. In regard to some others, I mean, of course, Robert Jackson, the U.S. Chief Prosecutor, is, widely remembered and revered. The opening speech of the prosecution, there's, stay the hand of vengeance, and all those, eloquent phrases are quoted again and again, in the literature, and so forth. I think Telford Taylor, I was very fortunate to have had some conversations with him, has not necessarily received his due. I mean, he's recognized certainly among academics and so forth, but not, I think, as widely for the role that he played both in leading the U.S. War Crimes Investigation Team in preparation for the trial, the deputy prosecutor there, and the chief prosecutor of the subsequent proceedings. But as you say, I mean, these are giant figures. And I think it's important that, fortunately, Ben Ferencz is still with us, but that as time goes on, it's very important to develop the human dimension of the trial, the individuals who devoted their time and energy to making the trial the success that it was. And that's something I think that we can also use the collection to do.
Well, Dr. Cohen, really, this is it's a tremendous project. I think the impact, all of the things that we've discussed today, the impact of this process that you're engaged in now will be a tremendous contribution to the issue, again, of not only telling the story of the brutality, the witness testimony, extremely important to know exactly what it was that people endured, and again, looking forward, the lessons from all of this for the present. This really is on a continuum, and I really think that the efforts of you and your colleagues and the Taube Center to do all of this really deserves a great deal of gratitude from all of us, not only in the Jewish community, of course, but elsewhere. So thank you for being with me here today. We appreciate your insights. I look forward to viewing the archives when they ultimately go online, and we wish you the very best going forward.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity and the excellent questions. And I hope that you may have the opportunity not just to view it online, but to come and see what we do at Stanford when we get this thing up and running. So you're definitely invited if you would ever like to do that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Our thanks to Dr. David Cohen for speaking to us today about the pioneering initiative that will centralize and digitize preservation of International Military Tribunal records from the Nuremberg Trials. Thank you, all of you, for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. Well, if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.